Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Carol Platt Leibeau, the president of Yankee Institute, and as all of you know, Yankee Institute is the eyes, ears, and voice for hardworking people who want a prosperous Connecticut. Our common sense solutions drive positive legislative results to strengthen our communities and build a vibrant, hopeful future. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Jason Hayes. Jason is the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy for the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Michigan. And Mackinac is a nonpartisan research and educational institute that's dedicated to advancing liberty and opportunity for all people through research and education. Jason, as many of you know, is also the author of Yankee Institute's most recent policy report, The Green Monster, a review of Connecticut's Climate Protection Act of 2025. As many of you will recall, last year we had the Green Monster legislation, so named by our own Megan portfolio, extremely destructive so-called environmental legislation. This year we had another iteration, and the report that Jason has authored critically examines Connecticut's originally proposed House Bill 5004, dubbed the Green Monster, sort of this year's mini Green Monster, which is the updated 2025 iteration of last year's legislation, and thankfully, much less pernicious. Jason, we are thrilled that you had time to join us. We appreciate your work in the environmental field and your stature there, and we are happy to turn it over to you.
All right, happy to be here. Thanks, Carol, for the intro. And I will attempt to share my screen here. We'll see if this works. And you guys can tell me if you can see the screen.
It's a little bit small, I think.
Uh-oh.
I wonder if there's some way to... Let's see. Ah, there. Yes.
We're good? Okay.
Yeah, I think if
Excellent.
people... Yep, blow that up, they'll be able to see it fine. Yep.
Perfect. So as Carol just noted, we're here today to discuss the Green Monster, Connecticut's Climate Protection Act of 2024 and 25. It's the state of Connecticut's plan to, I put in quotes, protect the climate. It's not going to actually, but we'll work with what they've given us here. The main focus is on greenhouse gas emissions reductions, net zero mandates, and that sort of thing. Again, as Carol noted, that in 2024, there was a version that passed the House in May, but there was no Senate vote, so Governor Lamont couldn't sign it into law. That was good for Connecticut because you guys dodged a bullet there. But as Carol noted, it was reintroduced in 2025, and this latest version is currently kind of stripped down. But as Carol noted at the start of this webinar, but also in the opening text to the report, that it's still a potential threat because as easily as the General Assembly was able to kind of pare the legislation down, they could just build it back up. And so we're continuing to discuss the previous version of the legislation as kind of a preemptive warning, just in case they decide to bring some of these things back. And so to try and understand the Green Monster, we've got a few explanatory bullets here. The greenhouse gas reduction mandates are kind of the primary tool by which the General Assembly is hoping to achieve this. They have the kind of stepping up 45, 70%, that sort of thing. But the big number is they want you to hit net zero by 2050. Throughout the legislation, they're using...
And Jason, if I can interject, I understand from some of our attendees that it's still coming across pretty small on people's screens. I think if everyone hits the little box or goes ahead and to expand their screen, they may be able to see the Jason slides a little bit, see them in a little bit larger format. If you take the corner of your screen and you pull it to the side, it can help your screen grow. Or if you see a little square in the bottom, you hit that, it'll expand your screen and it'll make it easier to see the slides.
Yeah, expand it so it fills your whole screen. So then hopefully people have that worked out. And as a kind of a backup, what I did is I sent all of the slides to Andrew. So we will also share these slides with anybody who wants them. I'm happy to, you guys are welcome to share them around.
So
So
please feel free to let Andy know if you need those, and we're happy to send them to you. Sorry, Jason, didn't mean to interrupt.
not a problem. So what I'll do then too here is I'll walk through the slides so people actually know what, if you can't see it, I'll still speak to it. So the legislation also has the state government, elected officials, and state agencies selecting winners and losers, which is a pretty common theme in progressive and green politics. So they're doing things like promoting heat pumps, solar canopies, geothermal, electric vehicles, and electric vehicle charging, home efficiency upgrades, and that kind of thing. They are continuing to do what they call in the latest version of the legislation significant investments, which means they're spending your tax dollars on zero carbon energy, energy efficiency, renewables, zero emission vehicles. Again, not only EVs, but sometimes they're pushing things like hydrogen cars and sustainable farming. They still have one state agency called the Connecticut Clean Economy Council as they call it the central coordinating body for spending on green energy and deciding where the money is going to go. Throughout the bill, they continue to use green catchphrases, things like they're prioritizing environmental justice communities and vulnerable populations. They use terms like nature-based solutions and climate smart. It's kind of all of this sort of like a hope and change kind of thing. Like you sort of know what they're talking about, but not really, because it could be, bent and twisted to fit a different agenda if they wanted it to. For the state agencies specifically, the legislation still mandates that they use only zero carbon energy sources. By earlier versions said 2040. And when I was re-reviewing the text of the bill today, it looked like the latest version now says by 2030. They use things like the social cost of carbon to evaluate the costs and benefits of the activities that they're mandating. They want the state agencies to publish greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategies and carbon sequestration efforts. And they even use things like conservation easements to try and push CO2 sequestration through forest management and that kind of thing. Now, conservation easements can be a useful tool, but if you read some of my other work, I won't go into it here, but they're useful, but they're not perfect because they can come back and bite you in a lot of different ways. So some of the problems that exist with the bill is that it's based on flawed scientific assumptions. So they continue to go with what's colloquially known as the consensus view on climate. They look at climate change drivers and they say CO2 is in the driver's seat when it comes to climate change. So they assume the greenhouse gas reductions in Connecticut are both necessary and effective at dealing with worldwide climate change issues. But the reality is climate change is influenced by a lot of different factors. CO2 is one of them, greenhouse gases, solar cycles, volcanic activity, oceanic oscillations, and we touch on those in the paper. So this narrow focus on just CO2 and net zero mandates is really misguided, especially when you consider Connecticut's negligible role in global emissions. And we'll look at this and compare Connecticut to what's going on in China in a upcoming slide. So I'll give you one example of why their solutions don't work. In the bill, again, as I was reviewing it this morning, the newest version has something where they're repeatedly advocating for urban agriculture. But if you're going to use and again, I put it in quotes, the science, because we always hear things like the science is settled, trust the science, those kind of things. But if you're going to rely on the science, then you have to keep up with how quickly it changes. And just last year, there was a study that came out that said urban agriculture, community gardens, that kind of thing actually have 6 times the carbon footprint of more standard agricultural practices. So the things that they're trying to do in this bill are actually undercutting their own efforts. If you actually accept, again, the science that they're trying to promote. So they're not even following their own rules, which is why their solutions don't really work.
Jason,
Yes,
it also might be that, do you think you have the slides in presenter mode? Because we see the
yes, I
next
do.
slide coming up. Um, if you
Oh,
if you
okay.
take them out, it might be easier for everyone to see.
How about if I do this? Is that
There
better?
you go. Now we see them.
Okay,
Perfect.
I'll read the small version because it's like I've got 2 different screens here. So,
Okay.
but again, what I'll do is you guys are free to have these slides, so
Yes. And now
you'll
our
be able to
audience
see
can
them.
follow along as you do it. Perfect.
Okay, good. I'm glad you caught that, Carol, because
Well,
I
it was
totally missed
technically
it.
Andy, but yes, credit where credit
Okay.
is due. So we're all good to go.
So some of the other flawed scientific assumptions that this bill is based on or relies on is this notion of extreme weather. So if you have watched things like the Deep Commissioner, uh, what is it, Department of Energy and Environment Protection for Connecticut, was on a news press conference last year after the August flooding, and she said that like that flooding was directly tied to climate change. But if you look at the weather that Connecticut and New England has had in the past, you can see not only is it not unprecedented, we had as bad or worse storms in the past. So in 1938, the Great New England Hurricane hit. In 1955, Hurricane Diane hit, and both of those caused billions, tens of billions of dollars of damage, caused loss of life across the region. And both of those occurred when CO2 in the atmosphere was below the ostensibly, we're told, safe number of 350 parts per million. So if those kind of things could happen, those bad storms like that could happen in the past. Clearly, there's more to weather and climate than just CO2. And so we discussed that in the paper. Looking again at what I started to talk about before, this idea of global context. Connecticut's emissions reductions efforts really will have negligible impact on what's happening. And Governor Lamont even gave the reason for that in the past, where he admitted that China produces more CO2 emissions in a day than the entire New England region does in a year.
Wait, so
So,
I'm sorry. China produces more CO2 emissions in a day than New England does in a
yes,
year.
and
Amazing.
that's straight from the mouth of your governor. So he
Nice.
he said that. So at the end of the day, there was a work. It was done by John Sanders, who's at the John Locke Foundation, and he produced a metric. He called it his China carbon time, and so he showed that Connecticut, if the state did its maximum reduction of 11.7 million metric tons from a 2005 baseline, it would offset 3.8 minutes of annual worldwide CO2 emissions. So you can go to zero in effectively. You can cut as much as you can, and it will only improve the climate for 3.8 minutes. And then China's emissions basically wash over it and completely cover over any work that you've done. And to give you some idea why that is, if you consider the United States right now has 177 gigawatts of currently operating coal plants. We have none planned for new construction. There's none under construction. So 177 gigawatts. China has almost an order of magnitude more operating under construction and planned coal. They have 1,460 gigawatts of coal. So the most that Connecticut can do is really nothing. It will have no impact on global climate, even if you shut down your entire economy. And so you can see the one graph here from it's a website called Our World in Data, and it shows the impact China's CO2 emissions compared to the United States and India. And for those that are interested, if you go to the website, you can fiddle with it and add other countries and graph different emissions levels. But you get a picture. China on its own produces more CO2 emissions than the rest of the developed world. So Connecticut can go to zero and it'll have no impact on global climate. So some of the other issues associated with this bill is that it's going to put enormous economic burdens on Connecticut residents. So Connecticut, as we show in the paper, already has the third highest electricity costs in the country. Only Hawaii and California have higher electricity rates. And then if you compare some of the things that we looked at, we did another study a few years ago on what it would take to electrify Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And so we showed that to electrify, to take propane out of the average UPer, the UP house, to remove propane and replace it with electrical appliances and electrical heating and that sort of thing, just to replace the appliances was going to cost about $25,000 per house, because you have to change out your stoves and your furnace and your hot water heater and all of those sorts of things. Then on top of that, in that same study, we showed that increased electricity costs in Michigan's Upper Peninsula would add about $3,900 a year to the average UP home. So you're spending about $300 a month on top of the $25,000 that you've already spent. So that's the kind of expense that Connecticut residents could look forward to if they continue with this plan to stop using fuel oil or natural gas and turning totally to electricity. And then there was the one study that you folks did recently. It's called The Staggering Cost of New England's Green Energy Policies, which for the
Yes.
listeners is also available on Yankee's website. It estimated that the cost to meet Connecticut's existing net zero mandates by 2050 was going to run the state 175 billion. So these are all added costs that on top of the costs to change over your house to electrical, you're also going to have to change over your entire system. So all of these costs are going to start adding up on top of the fact that you already paid the third highest electricity costs in the nation. So the costs are a problem, the science is flawed, there's a bunch of problems that you're dealing with. Now add on the fact that while you try to do this, you're going to cause problems with grid reliability for your state and across the whole New England region. So again, that study, The Staggering Cost of New England's Green Energy Policies, explained that there are blackout risks associated with going to variable energy sources like wind and solar. So they modeled outages lasting up to 18 hours. And they said that it was going to take more than double what the New England ISO had estimated in order to, you're going to have to build 225 gigawatts of new wind. And a lot of that was based on offshore wind expectations. So I'm sure anybody who's been looking at the news will remember some of the problems that's associated with offshore wind right now, challenges associated with the Endangered Species Act and impacts on critically endangered species like the North American right whale. All of those are going to be just amplified as you try to deal with this. There was several challenges we listed in the study. Eversource, one of your big utilities, estimates 1.5 to 2.4 billion in additional costs associated with upgrading transformers and substations across the state. And the intermittent sources, I know Carol has a question here. I'll just say, you're going to end up like Spain, and we can discuss it here more in a minute. There's going to be problems when you rely on variable wind and solar with grid reliability. And then one of the other big issues associated with this is, as part of all of these transitions, you're changing out heating oil and natural gas heating, switching over to electricity. At the same time as you're trying to electrify transportation, you're going to switch what is currently a summer peaking system where people use electricity to run air conditioning and stuff like that. You're going to switch your system over to a winter peaking system when you really need the electricity, because not having electricity and reliable energy could end up with people freezing in the dark. So it's one
Well,
thing to be
oh,
uncomfortable. Sorry, go ahead.
sorry, Jason. Yeah, I didn't mean to jump in, but that was one of the things that I just thought is always interesting. People talk a lot about, warming, but in fact, most deaths don't come about as a result of warmth. It comes about as a result of people freezing to death. And to the extent
Exactly.
that demand shift ends up peaking in winter, I was just headed exactly where you were headed, that you could end up with some very tragic cases of
Right.
low income people literally freezing to death. And, when we
Yes.
look at your blackout risk, with the outages lasting up to 18 hours, I mean, that also has some really severe health implications, because you have people who are on dialysis machines
Right.
or relying on refrigeration for medications. And if those sorts of things aren't reliable, then you also have health implications for that. And, when we talk about all of these spiraling costs, given that Connecticut's biggest challenge when we talk to people is affordability, you look at what
Yes.
all these costs mean, and all this is doing is amplifying in a really exponential way the challenges our state already confronts. So, anyway, thank you for allowing me to
Exactly.
interject and continue on.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I mean, the demand shift is going to definitely cause, it's going to endanger people. So to your point, Carol, we saw that in February 2021 when Texas had the big winter storm Uri blackouts.
Hmm.
Texas's state government published on the comptroller's website that more than 211 people died during that storm, whether as a result of hypothermia, exposure to cold, or carbon monoxide poisoning because they brought in a heater, like a charcoal heater or a natural gas powered heater, and tried to run it in their house and literally suffocated. So there's plenty of stories like that. There's stories in California during the summer blackouts where, again, healthcare related issues. There was one fellow, Robert Martis was his name, who did not have time to switch over from his plug-in oxygen generator to a battery backup oxygen generator, but he was suffering from emphysema and cough
Uh,
D and that sort of thing. And so he literally suffocated. So these are some of the problems that you're going to encounter as, I mean, not just you, because Michigan is doing the same thing. So we're going to encounter these problems as well.
we hope everyone's enjoying their lunch with our delightful stories of happiness and joy.
But it's giving you a chance to do something about it. So
Exactly. Exactly.
long,
And so
well
that
in
is
front.
knowledge is power.
Exactly. So part of that knowledge is power solution is, one of the things that if we're going to continue with net zero goals, we need to recognize that some sources do actually provide reliable, clean, you know, completely reliable power. So nuclear is a good example. So the Millstone nuclear power station in Connecticut provides 33% of the state's electricity. It could continue to supply that, but in earlier versions of the Green Monster Bill, they were talking about, well, maybe we won't include nuclear as a clean energy resource. But you really need to have that because nuclear is zero carbon, it's reliable base load, it provides energy security for the state, and the environmental benefits. Again, if we're focused on net zero, it's no emissions and has the smallest footprint of any clean energy source because it's so energy dense. You can get a lot of power out of a very small amount of nuclear fuels.
Jason, is
So
there any legitimate justification for overlooking nuclear?
the one challenge that we've written about in another paper, it's called Grading the Grid, which is on Mackinaw's website, it's expensive to build. And a
Right,
lot of that is related to extremely heavy federal regulation. And then also the progressive green groups, every time you try to build a new nuclear plant, they get in and they litigate and they slow the process down, which raises prices. That's
sure.
exactly what happened with the plants they were trying to build in South Carolina. They have now gone live. The reactors are online, but because of regulatory pressure and litigation, it extended the timeline and raised the prices by, almost double. So if we can deal with the regulatory pressure and the litigation and have the green groups actually recognize that nuclear meets the goals that they're trying to achieve, then maybe we could reduce the prices. We certainly are able to build them around the world because the Saudis are building them, the Chinese are building them, and they're building them for, a third the cost that we build them.
Right.
So it's definitely worthwhile. So
Got it.
the closing slide that I have here really is just focused on the best thing for the Connecticut legislature is to balance environmental goals with economic and physical reality. Because wind and solar, just because physics does matter, wind and solar cannot provide the reliable, affordable energy that Connecticut and Michigan and all of the states in between need. So climate is very complex. We should be a little bit more humble in our, putting together solutions to solve climate change. We need to recognize that there's a lot of time more to it than we are willing to admit when we just mandate things like, well, let's just do greenhouse gas regulations and that'll solve our problems. The legislature needs to do more to consider the economic impacts of what's going on. They need to embrace technological innovation. Again, looking at things like nuclear, you can have small modular reactors and that sort of thing brought online. Way more effective to have the market solve these problems than government regulators. And then I say at the last bullet point there, we need to start prioritizing energy security. That's something that we used to do in the past. At the same time as we were cleaning up our air and water and those sorts of things, we were focused on reliable and affordable energy. And once we get those kind of things dealt with, then we can do something else. We can worry about clean and efficient and that sort of thing. But really, especially in terms of like what you were talking about before, Carol, the people who are living on fixed incomes, retirees, people under the poverty line, they're the ones that are hit the hardest when prices go up and reliability goes down because the average somebody's earning six figures, they can afford a generator. Somebody living in the inner city can't.
Right.
So those are the kind of problems that you have to deal with. So with that, I think I'm past my time now. So I'm happy
Well,
to answer
that's fine. We
questions.
want to be respectful of everyone's time, but if someone has an urgent question, feel free to go ahead and send that. And in the meantime, one of the things that is interesting, you alluded to Spain earlier in your presentation, Jason, and I wondered
Yeah.
if you could talk a little bit about how Spain's recent power outage, how does that serve as sort of a foreshadowing to what happens when a country sort of monomaniacally pushes for net zero policies?
Yeah, and Spain is a very good example of where a lot of states like Connecticut, like Michigan, California are are headed. We're all going in that same direction. And Spain was, I mean, in I'd say it's better to say it's ironic than amusing that a week before they had their blackout, they were trumpeting the fact that they had hit 100% renewables. They were totally supplying their grid with renewable energy, primarily solar, but there was a bit of wind in there as well. They also have some hydro and some other things, but they were very proud of the fact that they had hit, the majority of their supply was coming from solar. And at the time of the blackout, they were at 72%, 60% of it was solar, 12% was wind. And those sources of energy don't do something that's called mechanical inertia. So big, heavy pieces of metal that spin around at a great rate of speed, that's what you get when you have coal, nuclear, hydro, natural gas. Because they're spinning, one of the basic laws of energy is that an object in motion tends to stay in motion. So that ability or that inertia and staying in motion tends to slow swings in what's called the frequency of the electricity that's being generated. And the European grid operates at 50 hertz. The North American grid operates at 60 hertz. Very small swings in that operating frequency range causes massive problems. So in Spain, they had 15 gigawatts of energy go offline in under 5 seconds. So the average, like one example, in Michigan, we had a nuclear plant that was closed down. It was one full nuclear plant was 0.8 gigawatts. So an entire nuclear plant we shut down is 0.8 gigawatts. They had 15 gigawatts go offline in under 5 seconds. And when you do that, because you don't have that spinning inertia, you can have relatively big swings in the frequencies. And that took everything offline. France sensed that there was a problem in the electrical supply, and they literally just kind of shut the door on Spain because they didn't want their system to be impacted. So they shut Spain off in what's called an interconnect. They just disconnected the country. And then when that happened, it kind of caused a cascading problem where then other substations and that started shutting off to avoid damaging the grid. And so the entire country went dark and was out for 18 to 23 hours. We are building the same system as Spain has by
Oh,
shutting down the
what could
grid.
be better?
That's, I mean, we're going to stop climate change, right? Even though we're not really, because China, as I explained, is dealing
Right.
with that for us. But that's our plan, is to build the same system that just shut Spain down. So when we talk about things like, blackouts for periods of 18 hours that were in the slide, that previous slide, that's real. It's definitely real because we saw it in Texas in February 21. We see it pretty regularly now in California in the summer. See it in Spain. We've seen it in other areas. Germany has had problems like this. The UK is having problems like this. We've done similar modeling for the state of Michigan. We're predicting the same thing. So it's becoming a very well-known and not only nationwide, but internationally understood phenomenon. And it's not only people at free market think tanks that are saying this, it's the people whose job it is to actually operate the grid. So you have things like in your area, it's called the New England ISO or the Independent
Yep.
System Operator. We have the Mid-Continent ISO where we are, or PJM and ERCOT in Texas and Cal ISO in California. All of these grid operators are going in front of federal House committees just 2 weeks ago. There were several of them that testified, we are endangering our grid. This is a serious problem. And again, these are the people whose sole job is to ensure that the grid runs stably, reliably, and affordably. And they're all sounding alarm bells and saying, this is becoming dangerous. So we really, like I said, we could see it happening in Spain and other areas, and we could just say to our elected officials, no, stop, don't do this, because reliable electricity is that important to
Right.
people's
Well,
health and our economy.
I wanted to get in a question. We had a couple of questions, at least two from our audience, and one of them references Germany and the fact that they've managed to just drive their energy costs up so far it's wrecking their economy. And could you comment on this phenomenon the problem, the problem that they have is that they've invested in all these renewables, but then ironically, we're all told that the renewables are going to make the cost of energy lower. But
Yes.
it ends up actually driving the cost of energy higher because of the reliability issue. And could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah,
Because,
and sure.
then you have to pay for the infrastructure to also have reliable energy.
Right. Exactly. So while I'm doing that here, I'll stop the share so we go back to a different picture. But yeah, so the same people that I just talked about, the independent system operators and that, or the RTOs, the regional transmission organizations, are the other ones.
Right.
Um, People from those groups are saying that same thing. So there was one fellow from MISO in Michigan's area who said exactly what you are saying. He said, you keep hearing things about the free fuel, right? You don't pay for the sun, you don't pay for the wind. But what you do pay for is the fact that the wind and sun are very diffuse energy sources, because it's hard to collect them. You have to build very big collection tools, wind turbines and solar panels and that sort of thing. And you compare that to nuclear that I talked about, is very energy dense. You have, basically in a fuel pellet, a nuclear fuel pellet the size of a pencil eraser, you can power a home for several months on something like that. So you get a very different sort of density of energy supply. And so what this fellow, his name is Todd Ramey, he testified before a House Energy Committee in Washington, and he said, look, you've got to build a lot more wind turbines and solar panels, and then you have to build transmission lines to connect them to the grid. And then because you can't rely on wind and solar to run 24/7, you have
Right.
to build more of them in other areas so that you hope that you capture the sun and wind that's blowing somewhere else, which means then you have to build more transmission. On top of that, you can have regional areas where, okay, there's no wind and there's no sun because it's cloudy, and it's what the
Sure.
Germans call Dunkelflaute, the dark doldrums.
It's a
Um,
wonderfully expressive language.
it's
Yeah.
just, Germans have lots of interesting words like that. But
Right.
so when Dunkelflaute hits, you can go to what they've called a wind drought, or problems like that. So when that happens, you have to have another system that will supply 100% of your needs, or 95% of your needs, or some major percent, which means you're building the natural gas and the nuclear system anyway. So now you've built two systems, and one of them kind of works sort of when the weather cooperates, and the other one you're not really using very efficiently. It's like driving in the city. There's a lot of stop start sort of traffic instead of driving on the highway. These other systems are built and they're much more efficient when you run them full out like you're driving on the highway. Since you're building two systems and you're building a lot of the first system and all the transmission and all that sort of thing, Todd Ramey basically said, you've got to pay for all of that. So the
Right.
notion that you're getting free fuel because you don't pay for the wind, don't pay for the sun, does not follow. If you start adding, there's a
Right.
lot
There's
of imposed
a certain
costs.
defiance of common sense in all of this. Um,
Right.
we have another question. What do you think about geoengineering to control temperatures? Something
Mm,
it looks like the UK is researching, and I'm not even familiar with that geoengineering.
yes.
Yeah, they're going to
The
control. Yeah, great. We're going to control the weather, huh? Sounds feasible.
Yes, next comes the weather control satellites.
Right.
Um, no, what they do right now is they send up balloons that have sulfate particles in them, and essentially what they do is the balloon gets up high enough, it pops, and these sulfate particles spread out across the sky. They're trying to mimic the effect of what are called cirrus clouds. If you look up in the sky, you can see the thin, wispy clouds up in the sky on a summer day. They're very high level ice crystals that are up in the sky, and they tend to reflect sunlight back into outer space. So there are others that are trying to do that. Bill Gates is one example. He's
Wow.
he's studying it as well. The short version of it is that I honestly, that if there's something in climate change that would frighten me, that would be it. Because we're messing with things that we really don't
Don't understand.
understand.
Right. It's
Right,
like a time for a little bit of humility, people.
right.
It's a lot of confidence in our own ability. And sometimes I don't know, you know. Um, so then just to zoom out from the and sort of, because it has been this article of faith that CO2 has been the main driver of climate change. But could you
Mhm.
explain, as we sort of start to wind down here, um, it seems to me that one of the things that might be productive is for people to sort of try and go back and re-examine a lot of these things that have been taken as articles of faith that actually might not so much be. Um,
Right.
and one of the things that I thought some of our listeners might find of interest is how the historic storms that Connecticut endured in the early to middle 20th century shows that in fact CO2 is not the main driver of climate change.
Right. Yeah, to be honest, the sun is, which isn't surprising because the sun gives us most of our warmth and that sort of thing. But
Right?
actually, right now, I'm reading an interesting book that just got published by, there's a climate scientist named Judith Curry who just published a book called Climate Uncertainty and Risk. It's an extremely interesting book for those that are interested in that sort of thing. But in the book, Curry goes through and she explains that a lot of what we consider to be basic scientific fact, we've all heard the science is settled. A lot of that
Yes, about
science,
so many things, Jason. Yes.
yeah, I know. So a lot of that science is based on certain assumptions. So that the key assumption that drives a lot of our understanding about settled science is something called representative concentration pathways. And those RCPs are based on how much energy we think is trapped in the atmosphere by heating and the things that we put into the atmosphere, greenhouse gases. There's one that's called RCP 8.5 that's called the business as usual scenario. It's a modeling scenario that they run. Business as usual requires us to stop all sorts of climate mitigation efforts so we don't electrify anymore. We stop, we reverse our trends with coal. We don't, not only do we not shut down any more coal plants, but we expand our use of coal by 500%. So all of, a bunch of things that just seem wildly unrealistic. We're
Right.
not going to do those things, right? Because we found more efficient, cleaner ways to do things.
Sure.
But that's the business as usual case that drives a lot of the settled science that we keep hearing about. Completely unreasonable. And even other climate scientists have called it increasingly implausible. But yet, that's the system that drives, or the understanding, the scenario that drives our understanding of climate science. So increasingly, we're seeing unrealistic assumptions are really coloring our understanding of the science. So our understanding of the science is not settled at all. And the more you read about it, the more you understand. I mean, there's another study that I just read that was amusingly, it said the more you understand, your understanding of climate science is actually inversely related with your level of concern. So you have less concern about the potential impacts of science, climate issues and climate change, the better you understand it. So, and these are published peer-reviewed studies. We're seeing these sorts of things that, yeah, our understanding of the science is very similar to our understanding of the science of COVID. Like we had the settled science. We knew how
Right.
to deal with COVID, right?
And yeah,
Oh
right.
yeah,
The
but
6 feet
except,
apart and the masking and
right.
all this other business. Right.
Yeah,
It was
except we
settled
didn't.
until it wasn't. Yeah.
Correct. And so we're seeing the same sort of thing with climate science. The more
Well,
you understand, the less you're worried.
as we wind up, it does seem to me that one of the takeaways from here then is that based on a bunch of faulty assumptions and misunderstandings of what is settled but not really settled science, we have
Mhm.
legislators creating policies that are going to make our state less affordable, especially for our
Right,
most vulnerable citizens,
exactly.
and create some very real health concerns, all in an effort to mitigate an issue that really, given what China's doing, couldn't be mitigated even if we shut down our entire economy.
Yes,
And
spot on.
so, what we are talking about here is an exercise in needless futility, which would sound redundant, but in this case isn't. Have I missed something, Jason?
No, that's it exactly. That is the headline for your next op-ed right there. Do do that, or the next time you testify before a General Assembly committee, they need to hear this because they're going to do the wrong thing to solve a problem that they really don't need to solve.
Well,
So yeah,
I am grateful because I was able to extract that little gem of insight thanks to the study you have authored for us, which you can find on the Yankee Institute website. And Jason, would you care to also give us the Mackinac Institute website if
sure.
people would like to find more of your work?
Yep. So you can get the Mackinac Center's website is just mackinac.org. So it's MACKINAC.org.
And we are very grateful to you for having joined us. Again, this was Jason Hayes, who's the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy for the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Michigan, author of Yankee Institute's most recent publication, The Green Monster, a review of Connecticut's Climate Protection Act of 2025, ironically named. And we are very grateful to you, Jason, for taking the time to share your vast store of knowledge and insight with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I had
Well,
fun.
thank you. And as always, we are grateful to all of you, our Yankee Institute friends and partners, for having joined us for this webinar. We look forward to doing more of these every time we release a policy report or study. And so we thank all of you, and we thank you for your partnership and support in ensuring that we create a state where everyone is free to stay, grow, and prosper. Thanks so much, Jason. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Have a great day.